Hi everyone. Got this model here. We're going old school here. This is some really old technology that's been around for a very long time, and what this represents is what they call a capstan or capstan, depending on how you pronounce it. And essentially, what it is a way of pulling a large mass, some heavy weight. You can see right here, this is called the trundle head or the turret, or some would call it a spool because it looks almost like a sewing spool, right? And they found that when they wrapped a line around there and were able to rotate the trundle head or the turret, that they could pull an extreme amount of weight. For instance, the old sailing vessels, the old wooden sailing ships, like let's say, for instance, the Constitution here in Charlestown, right? That's like 3 million pounds of boat, and how do you get that close to shore, right? So they would put a capstan either on the boat or it would be on shore. Most of the time they put them on the boat, right? Because every dock they went to wouldn't necessarily have one. So they were part of the design of the boat, and they were able to put a line on the shore and then spin the capstan, or the windlass is another name they can go by. And with the line wrapped around there, they would be able to pull the boat closer to shore. They were also used for hauling nets filled with fish, raising barns, the sides of barns. They would get a capstan, and they date back to like the 14th century, which is quite a while ago. And so when you hear the term capstan and windlass, they're actually the same. The only thing that really differentiates them is the orientation that the trundle head or the turret is actually in. And so in this condition where it's horizontal, this would actually represent a windlass. And let me just get the weight out of the way here that we're going to use a little bit later. And when they're mounted vertical, I made this one just a model piece out of the black so you could see it better. But when they're mounted in the vertical like that, that was considered more of a capstan. So they figured that out by wrapping the line around there. The more wraps, the more cinching that took place. That's where the line actually begins to choke around the trundle head, and that causes the friction and allows to pull. So the way the old ones were, they had that the turret, we'll say, and then they put these. Sometimes they were called oars, other times they were called poles or posts. And what they would do is they would gather. In this case, it would be 6 individuals, and they would walk in a circle around, and they would wrap the line around that, as you can see, because it wasn't motorized. And then they got really smart, and they decided that they would attach a horse to one of these poles and just walk the horse around in a circle. And that's like kind of the beginning of horsepower, right? So I think it was this guy right here that probably was the one that came up with that idea, right? He looked over and said, hey, what about that horse? So that's kind of a cool thing to see right there. And you know, the line would get spooled around there like this. And I'm only going to do it real quick and once like that. And as you can see, as they pulled a little tension on what they call the fall line or the drop line, it has a few different names, and as you spin this, you can see that the line is beginning to wind up on that. So that's kind of cool. So this is kind of going back way old school with that. So that's kind of fun. So let's see, how would we thread this? So in this case, if you look at the device a little bit closer, I don't want to get too much into the design of the device because there are other videos that really represent what we did here, especially the one that does the the gear ratio. It actually looks the same, roughly the same, and there's information in there how to figure out the gear ratio, which in turn will give you enough information to figure out whether you're trying to achieve speed or you're trying to achieve torque. So again, I always talk real quick, the motor mount, everything's in line, the centers between these idler gears and the driven gear and the output gear, all those have to be related to each other in order to have contact and make the gears so that they don't slip. So this is a little gear reducing transmission for this one. Because speed wasn't important back when you're pulling something as heavy as a ship, right? It's more the you'd want the torque, and so with this one here, you can see how when I energize that, you can see that the spool is working, or the trundle head or turret, spool, drum, they call them also, is turning in a counterclockwise rotation. So let's see how we would rig this. So I'm going to, this is just a brass weight. It weighs about, right here, this weighs about 3¼ pounds, which, that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you pick this up, that's pretty strong, pretty heavy. So I'm going to feed my line through this hole right here, and here's another little ancient nautical term for you. This is called a hawse, the hawse hole, and we're going to pull that through, and this is going to wind in the counterclockwise direction. So I'm going to wrap this, and you don't want the line to overlap each other, so I'm going to do that several times and then hold off. And just by applying a little bit of pressure with the fall line, which is in my right hand over here, just by applying a little bit of pressure, you can see that that weight is going around the trundle head or the turret. And as soon as I release the tension on the fall line, it stops pulling. So that's how they pulled in like 3 million pounds of ship. In a ship, this shaft right here that goes down to the motor, it actually goes down through several decks so that they don't have any stresses on that trundle head or that barrel drum. So that's how they work. And in reverse, if we were to wind this up again, and again, I'm going to go right around maybe 3 or 4 times. And let's say that this were representative of the ship, and my brass piece right here was the land or the dock. And I turn this on, and if I hold my weight stationary to represent mass, the land mass, you'll see that eventually this will start cinching up, and it's pulling the ship to shore, if you will. So that's that. Got crossed up there. That's something that they tried to avoid, because then you lose the fall line if that happens, right? Because now it's cinched on there itself. So as you can see in this view, I have the 3¼ pound weight, and I have that hanging. So I'm going to do a deadlift with this, just using 2 fingers to turn the trundle head or the spool or drum or whatever you want to call this. And you'll see that just with 2 fingers, 3½ pounds or 3¼ pounds, I'm able to lift without any effort. As long as I maintain a little bit of tension on the fall line, you can see how just with 2 fingers it's quite effortless. And then if I do release the tension on the fall line, obviously the weight's going to come out of my hand. Where the real riggers that actually would be using something like this, they have all these tethers and different guy lines that would prevent that from being able to pull back on itself. And actually, this kind of led to the invention of the ratchet, also, where there's a pawl that catches a void in the trumbull head itself that doesn't allow it to retract. So it's kind of cool. You can see that 3¼ pounds with just 2 fingers. It's it's quite the mechanical advantage. So that's maybe something you could use. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of a capstan, or in this case, because of the orientation being horizontal, a windlass. Now, one last thing, right? You'll look at this spool and you'll say, well, it's just a winch. Well, there is a significant difference between a winch and a windlass and a capstan, and that being is the winch actually winds the spool, fills with the line. It stores it as it's filling it. It doesn't have the fall line, right? So the line would be attached to the spool and then it would collect in there. Well, they found that would be a problem, right? Because can you picture 100 yards of really massive line to pull in a ship? How big that spool would actually have to be to gather that much line. So that's where the Capstan comes in, and they use them for pulling anchors. They use them for just like I said, just anchorage onto shore. Um, so that's about it for that one. It's a fun one that generates questions, and it's kind of neat to see really, really old technology, and it's still in use today in sailboats and for pulling in sheets, or the sails on a large sailing vessel. That's a lot of sheet you're pulling in, and you'd never be able to do it just pulling on a line, right? So um, that's what we use. Hopefully that helps.